Let's look at the latest now on the Moscow concert hall shooting. Russian authorities have announced that 4 people directly involved in the shooting are among 11 people detained for the attack that has claimed at least 115 lives. For more on this, I'm joined by Musa Mdunge from the University of Dundee. Musa, appreciate your time. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Another terrible incident that's happened, 115 people killed. What else do we know about the perpetrators of this? We know that 4 people have been arrested.
Thank you so much for having me, Hugo, and good afternoon to you and to your viewers. So, what we know so far about these terrorist attacks that occurred in Moscow is a group by the name of ISIS have claimed responsibility of these attacks. These attacks happened in a very famous theater called the Krukos City Hall, and normally when artists from overseas would perform in Russia, in Moscow, this was one of the venues that would be used. And so a very popular venue for performances where people could gather. And like many terrorist attacks that have often occurred, particularly in Europe, this fits into the style of terrorist attacks that ISIS would have executed, as they have done, in fact, in times past, even including in 2017 and 2019, several terrorist attacks in Russia were claimed by ISIS. You will recall that Russia has been fighting a war in Syria and in Iraq in support of the Syrian government against ISIS. And so many would believe that this particular attack is in response to Russian military intervention in the Middle East. And it's interesting that it comes at a time where Russia is, of course, engaged in a war in Ukraine. And as we've seen in reports, the framing around this particular incident, particularly from the Russians, has been to try and make a connection between this terrorist attack and the Ukrainian government. The very fact that in escaping Russia, these terrorist attackers, in actual fact, ran towards Ukraine. And so there's belief that Ukraine has been aiding and abetting these particular terrorists. Unfortunately, or fortunately, there's no proof of that particularly. When one considers how Ukraine has engaged in this particular war, nothing points in terms of methodology that this can be linked to the Ukrainian government. And so, 111 and 15 people have been killed, and about 187 have been injured. And this is turning out to be perhaps the worst terrorist attack in Russia since the 2004 terrorist attacks that were exercised by the Chechen terrorist group at the time, which were very, very critical in helping boost, in fact, the popularity of Vladimir Putin, because fundamentally he entered power as a person who would ensure security and stability for Russia. So
Musa, if you'll allow me to come in there, if you will. So what we do know is that a few weeks ago, the United States, I think it's 10 days ago, if it's as long as that, indicated that there was a potential breach in security and that there was likely to be some form of terrorist activity in Russia. Do we know if the Russians took this warning seriously or not? And potentially, what were the consequences of hearing from the United States that there was an impending security threat? Clearly, that information was true.
Well, when we look at the level of security in Russia during the period of this terrorist attack, it is said that, the security levels had been brought down. So in many ways, one could argue that the Russians simply ignored the Americans. You will know that since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, the Crimean invasion, there has been a ceasing between counter-terrorist efforts and collaboration, particularly between Moscow and Washington, D.C. And so the very fact that we are experiencing a high level of tension in that relationship is certainly, and one can certainly make the argument that tensions in the U.S.-Russia relationship have led to the Russians ignoring critical and important intelligence as provided by the United States. And it is in American policy to do no harm. So their policy is in matters of terrorist attacks where they have the intelligence, regardless of who is of the relationship with that particular country, whether it be Russia or China, America in its legal framing has bound itself in sharing that intelligence. And they did that. They did do that in terms of this particular case. But of course, the Russians ignored it. And in fact, what we are hearing from the Kremlin is there is now a scheme to paint these particular terrorist attacks as ones that have been manufactured and designed by not only Ukraine, but with the help of Washington, D.C., in a way to avert taking blame for not listening to this critical intelligence as it came from the Americans.
So how else has the Russian government responded to the attack outside of laying those claims, as you suggest? Are measures being taken to ensure the safety of public in the aftermath?
Well, interestingly, you would assume that in such a particular incident happening, that things such as imposing a curfew would happen, but we've not seen that happen in Moscow yet. So while there's an increased security presence in the capital, the measures that have been taken do not speak really to the seriousness of this particular incident. And one understands why. For Vladimir Putin having just won this election, he would like to frame his leadership as one where, the country is at peace, there is security, where he is in control of not only the security apparatus, but on all sectors of the state. And unfortunately, it is likely that we won't see perhaps an increased level of security that would be needed in such a particular case. If you go back to 9/11 or other previous terrorist attacks, where we saw the governments take a stronger stance on these attacks. We're not seeing that from Russia. Russia does not have the capacity to mount a response against ISIS. It's already fighting a war in Ukraine. And we've seen the fact that their military isn't as strong as they would like to present it. And so there are weaknesses in Russian intelligence, weaknesses in the Russian military, and it will be interesting to see the political response in terms of the aftermath, particularly for a person like Vladimir Putin, who frames himself as a strong man of Russia. And so this really is very much a dig and a hole to that very reputation that he has tried to present and uphold.
Musa, you raised some interesting questions, and that's to the weakness, if you will, of Russia, and that it is currently fighting that war with Ukraine. So much of its resources are targeted at that continued war in Ukraine, which is going on for a couple of years now. Does this then suggest that this is not the end of these attacks on Russia? Because you suggest that Russia is pretty vulnerable at this point.
Yes, Russia is pretty vulnerable at this point. And the fact is, Hugo, Russia has a strong history of terrorist attacks. You think back in the 21st century. In 2002, they had a terrorist attack. In 2004, 2006, in 2010. In 2011, they had 3 terrorist attacks. In 2013, 2 terrorist attacks. And the year which they had the highest level of terrorist attacks happens to be in 2019, where they experienced 4 terrorist attacks in that year alone. So this is a country that is very much used to having terrorist attacks happening. And the question then comes, what is the Federal Security Service, the FSB, doing about this particular issue? And in many ways, for the Russian government, it is a time to rethink the notion of Russian interventionism, particularly in places such as the Middle East. It's clear, Hugo, that the Russians have not learned lessons from the 1980s when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan And so it is framed, or we must frame this around Vladimir Putin's obsession to return to a period of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Empire. And so one may argue that really all we are seeing happening is that the chickens have come to roost. And unfortunately for Vladimir Putin, a continuation of weakness in terms of dealing with terrorism and losing ground in terms of the war in Ukraine may well fester further divisions within the political elite that he leads.
So let's talk about international reaction to this catastrophe. We do know that when Russia invaded Ukraine, the vast majority, or certainly a significant number of countries in the West, came out to their rescue. So let's talk about the allies of Russia. What is the response like being internationally?
Well, internationally, interestingly enough, there has been a goodwill response towards the Russian people, particularly given this particular accident. In fact, the French president himself expressed support for the Russian people during this time, condemned the terrorist attacks, and it is expected that around the world, leaders will express shock and disdain for these particular terrorist attacks. But whether in any way this particular goodwill will extend to the thawing of relations between Western Europe as well as Russia is unlikely at this point. And while Russia does have allies in the form of China, in the form of North Korea and Iran, what the U.S. is trying to frame as this new axis of evil, unfortunately, that partnership or alliance that they have is not in the same framing as you would find in NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because there, those countries are bound by treaty to come to the defense of each other in light of an attack. And we saw that happen after the 9/11 attacks, where, many of the partners, the allies of the United States, came to its aid, supported its war in Afghanistan, Iraq war to a less degree, but certainly because of the security agreements that they had, they were bound to step in. That's different in this case. We don't see that happening here, where China itself, in fact, faces its own challenges that unfortunately don't get airtime in the media. But we do hear reports that even China itself tends to face some incidences of terrorist attacks. So it will be interesting to see if there'll be further assistance from countries of the world, particularly the West. But it is unlikely that we will see that happening, given the fact that Ukraine is such a sticky point at the time, and no side seems to want to go to the negotiation table.